Good morning. How are you?
Very good. And Leslie McNitt, who's Public Policy Director, Trade and Biotech from the National Corn Growers Association. Leslie, good morning to you.
Good morning, Terry. Good morning, everyone.
I'm going to start with Melissa. So Melissa, the screen is yours. Good morning.
Thank you so much, Terry. Very good to see so many people participating in this and also hearing where it is being broadcast. I'm going to share my screen and talk a bit about the fundamentals of trade and why trade is so important to farmers. So let's see if we can do that right quick. Here we go. So thank you so much for having us this morning. This is a very important topic. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and also to share some information and get your questions. It's exciting to see this. So first off, I want to talk about the U.S. Grains Council, where I work. So I'm the Director of Strategic Relations there. Our organization is actually supported by all of you, supported by Michigan farmers. We are the export market development organization for U.S. corn farmers, as well as producers of DDGs and ethanol. And our goal is really to promote your products overseas. We are charged with building markets outside of this country for those products and for grains in all forms, as we say it. So all of the feed grains that you are producing that go overseas in whatever form, whether that be corn, ethanol, DDGs, or other products, we are responsible for building those markets and ensuring a continued increase in demand from overseas customers. So our mission really is, as you see on the screen, developing markets, enabling trade, and improving lives. We are intending to find new markets. We're intending to help solve some of the trade challenges that Leslie and I will talk about this morning. And ultimately, that is to improve your profitability as well as build the businesses and the economies of our partners overseas so they can purchase more and more. We work around the world. We have standing offices in 9 locations, including in China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in North Africa, as well as in Mexico and in the Western Hemisphere. And really, we have partners there, both staff and consultants, as well as friends in the industry, local partnerships that work to meet directly with customers to both kind of build those markets and then also address challenges, as we said. So the reason we're really doing this is that trade impacts every farmer. If you are a farmer, you are directly impacted by trade. Your profitability is directly impacted by trade. 1 in 3 acres in this country are really planted for exports. And we know that that overseas demand is critical because the vast majority of the world's population actually lives outside of the US. Here in the US, we eat as much as we really possibly can, and we try to use as much ethanol in our fuel as we possibly can as well. And so we know that future demand really does lie overseas. And though it doesn't feel like it sometimes, demand is rising. Population is rising. Certainly the desire for more and better protein is rising. And that demand is out there. We have to go out and get it. And that's really what we are focused on at the Council for the benefit of Michigan farmers and farmers throughout the rest of the United States. We think about exports in terms of grains in all forms. So again, that's ethanol, that's corn, that's DDGs. And then we also promote sorghum and barley, other feed grains, as well as smaller products like corn gluten meal, corn gluten feed, corn distiller's oil. And then we know that value-added products that we export include meat products that use corn and use DDGs to produce. And part of that does go overseas. So looking at grains in all forms in a more holistic way, we say how much of what you are producing really is going to the customers who are demanding it outside of this country. And that's the way we look at it. And when we look at it as far as how does it break down, about 45% of grains in all forms exported in the last marketing year really went out in the form of raw corn, whereas lots of other exports happened in the form of ethanol, distillers grains, and the meat products. So talking about trade and why trade, and we always start here. It's very important to think about what is it that really is driving us to pay attention to trade. And the economic theory behind trade is that trade benefits the whole economy in the long run. So often, we hear about trade, especially in popular conversation, as it's a positive or it's a negative. And the research really shows that trade is, and I think common sense also shows, trade is a positive on the whole over time. So individual places may or may not benefit from trade. Individual industries or sectors of industries may or may not benefit from trade right now. But trade has to be really looked at in a big picture sense over time. Typically, trade agreements take many years to put together. They certainly take many years to enforce. And this is part of building economies, both our own and others. So again, that rising tide, lifts all boats. Trade is intended to allow economies and individual businesses like your own to produce more of what you're really efficient at and less at what you're not efficient at, and then swap. That's really the point behind it. Gains are not necessarily equally distributed, and it's hard to look at trade in terms of a week or a month or sometimes even a year. You've got to look at the big picture. And we know, again, that even when it may not feel like it, demand is rising and trade is also rising. We have seen that very clearly over the last several decades, and we want to be able to find those markets and get access to those markets so that trend can continue. Trade's impact on the US economy is largely positive, and it's a pretty simple formula. Trade equals economic activity equals jobs and income. So the idea behind building export markets as an economy, not just agriculture and certainly not just corn, is that trade allows us to be more efficient. It allows us to spread ideas and innovation. It expands consumer choice. If you've ever had blueberries in the winter, I'm guessing that that is a benefit there. It does, however, cause the composition of employment to change, and certainly the composition of demand. And I know some of you have probably seen that over the decades on your operations, as well as recently. For instance, China re-entering the market has really changed some things as far as the demand picture. So that's kind of the big picture of trade and one of the arguments we're trying to make. Now, specifically to agriculture, it's important to realize that this industry is supporting an enormous amount of our economy. Food and agriculture industry, we often think of ourselves as relatively small, and there are a relatively small number of farmers in our country compared to the past, where a lot of people were farmers and had direct ties to the farm. But here we see food and agriculture industry really supports, more than 20 million jobs. That piece of the economy is actually 20% of our economy. It's enormously powerful to think about. Everything from seed to transport, manufacture, all of that put together is actually a big piece of what drives the US system. And so it's important to realize that what happens to agriculture obviously impacts the rest of the whole. Specifically for agriculture also, I love this slide, which comes from USDA, because it really says the truth, which is export or shrink. The reality is that we are not demanding significantly more here in the United States because we have plenty. We are, as a country, although again, in pockets that's not true, but as a country, we are incredibly wealthy. We have an incredible number of resources and we consume as much as we would like. And we know we still need more demand to continue to be kind of moving product that we are producing and to be able to kind of have a place to go for as efficient as we can be in producing. And that demand is overseas. Within agriculture, the need for overseas demand is highly variable. The amount exported by commodity is highly variable. Some crops are even more dependent upon exports, and some are less so. So you see, cotton, an enormous amount of cotton leaves this country. About half of wheat leaves this country. When you get down to corn, it's more in the 25% range when you consider grains in all forms, and less when you consider just commodity corn. That still makes an enormous difference, both in long-term profitability, as in demand, and short-term profitability in terms of basis and other calculations. It's also important to realize we are a trading nation. We were built around, engaging with the world and having a strong economic tie to other parts of the world. That's one reason we decided to become a nation. And this still holds very true within our national fabric. We want to engage with the world. We want to be world leaders. And certainly in agriculture, we are. Despite what you may hear in the press sometimes, and sometimes even like in local communities, for the most part, Americans understand these things about trade. They support trade. They want to see us out there building markets and, again, being innovators in the world. That's held true over time, and it's also become stronger over time as people have realized how integrated our economy is to the wider economy. It'll be very interesting in the coming years to see how the pandemic, which in some ways has really helped trade and really showed us how important that economic integration is, and in some ways has really caused some challenges because we've wondered, like, should we be producing certain things here? It'll be interesting to see how that debate continues and how that impacts our wider views of trade and exports, and particularly as it relates, of course, to agriculture. Again, as we see, that underlying demand exists. So the world's population is growing. The world's wealth overall, this year might be an exception, but in general is growing. People want more and better food. And when you are moving from $2 a day to $4 a day or $4 a day to $10 a day in income, the first thing you want is more and better food. You want eggs, you want milk, you want proteins, and you want cleaner burning fuel. You want a better environment. Those are all things that we are providing as an agriculture industry to the world. One thing a former chairman of ours says that I really appreciate is markets don't just happen, you have to work to make them happen. And that's really what we are trying to do and what our sister organizations are doing out there in the world for your products. We are going out and saying, okay, that's great, that's wonderful, there's demand out there. Now, how do we find it? How do we get it? And how do we make sure that there's a US preference? So when people have the opportunity to buy from, Brazil or Argentina or Ukraine or whatever, that they're choosing the US instead. And really that comes down to this formula: trade policy and market development equals sales. So in a minute, Leslie's going to talk in a lot more depth about trade policy. We are obviously very much focused on market development, which is going out, finding those markets and making sure that people understand how to access them. And those two things really do have to work together to promote overseas sales. If you don't have policy that lets products in, or if you don't have policy that provides a preference for products, you're not going to be able to go in and develop a market. You can't make an argument to buy a product if somebody, literally can't move it in, or if they can't afford it because of taxes or tariffs. If you just go in and do trade policy, though, and you say, okay, here's access to the market, but the people there don't necessarily know about your product, they don't know how to use it, they don't know how to contract for it or buy it, then you've also missed part of the equation. So we really have to work with both. And we are often working on that in this broader environment, right? Supported by your checkoff dollars, supported by USDA, the government, our partnership with NCGA and other organizations. It really is a whole systems view of how we go out and work with our overseas customers. We know that trade agreements create opportunities for agriculture. If you're able to see the slides, you can see this is a great one from USDA also, where we see that agriculture exports as well as agriculture imports, because that's an important part of the equation also, have been rising over time. And every time we hit a new trade agreement, it bumps up again. We know that access matters. On the market development side, we know that doing certain activities also matter. So providing information and research, putting customers and suppliers together, having conferences and trade shows, which now is very much an online activity, working on those policy elements to make sure that there aren't barriers to trade, or when there are, that we are trying to engage them as much as possible, and connecting those customers directly back to the value chain and back to farmers, because they really want to see and know who's producing the products that they are buying. They want to understand what that system looks like, and they want to have confidence in it from their own direct experience. That's a lot of the work that we do, in this case in a virtual sense, but trust me, as soon as possible, we're going to have people flying over here. It's going to be madhouse, because that on the ground experience, that's person to person experience, is so critical. That's what drives a lot of our programming here in the US, and also that's why we have people all over the world. So we often say future markets are developed today. If you look at these photos, if you're able to see the slides, lots of chickens, a couple cows, these are places where we've been working for 5, 10, 20 years. And we know that, and I think agriculture is a unique industry because almost everyone has a long-term view. You don't get into agriculture for, the next quarter. If you think back to the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years of your experience, how has your operation grown? And truly, that's what we're trying to do with overseas markets too. Over time, those markets will grow. They will, their economies will grow, their populations grow, and we want to help that process. We also want to be engaged in that process to ensure, again, that our products are at the forefront, that we know that we have access, and that we know that there's a development of a US preference. The new reality is a lot of this happens online. I'm sure you've seen anyone you work with who is in an office is now in a computer. In some ways, that's lovely. We're able to see more people. We're able to do events like this. Our staff is no different. We have people all over the world working. And we actually do have the opportunity also to have some people in certain markets where it is a different situation. They're able to combine that online work with in-person work. And we're doing that case by case as much as we can. We have found, however, as many challenges as there are in this environment, there are also opportunities. We're able to reach different businesses we couldn't otherwise. We're able to reach a lot of different people within businesses that we simply could not have engaged if we were purely doing in person, and especially in-person travel. With every cloud, there are silver linings, and we are like others making the best of it, because it's an interesting experiment in addition to a challenging time. With that, I leave you with, this is the thing we say all the time: when trade works, the world wins. And really our goal, and I think the goal of what Leslie's going to talk to you about, is kind of how to make trade work and how we're going to work on that in the near future. But this really is where we're focused. We're trying to make trade work for farmers. We're trying to make trade work for our country, for our economy, and for the people here who need good jobs, and people overseas who need your products. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this morning, and look forward to answering questions and covering any material you'd like. Thanks so much.
Melissa, thank you very much. Very good presentation, and I'm sure that a lot of folks are going to have some questions for you. So again, we want to remind our viewers to just put the cursor down on the Q&A and type in your question, and we will be getting to Melissa with her answers a little bit later on. Before we get to our next speaker, Leslie McNitt, up on the screen, you do have a box. We'd like you to fill that out if you could. Just take a moment. And again, once you're done with that screen, done with that box, we'll continue with our next presenter. Again, questions and answers. For those of you that came in as Melissa was talking, we will be fielding questions at the end of Leslie's presentation, and it'll be for both of our ladies, for either Melissa or Leslie. So type those in. Just put your cursor down on the Q&A and type in your questions. We've got a very good turnout today, and I do anticipate a number of questions. For those of you that are watching on Facebook, you can type in the comments section on Facebook, and we'll be taking a look at that as well. So hopefully you have filled out the question box, and now we want to move on. Our next presenter is the Public Policy Director from the National Corn Growers Association. I'd like to present now and give you the screen, Leslie McNitt. Leslie, good morning.
Thanks, Terry. Good morning, and good morning to everybody joining us today. Allow me a minute here to work out my technical side of things. All right, here we go. So
looking good.
As Terry mentioned, I work for the National Corn Growers Association, and I'm based in the Washington, D.C. office on the public policy staff. I'm going to talk a little bit about current events and policy issues in trade right now. I'll talk about the incoming Biden administration and implications for trade policy. I'll walk through NCGA's policy priorities and some of the programs that NCGA supports, of course, with the generous support of all of the state corn associations and checkoffs, and then join my friend Melissa in answering any questions that you have. So I think this is a good segue from Melissa's presentation, just to sort of recap, why is trade important to corn farmers? Why do you have a lobbyist in Washington whose time is dedicated to pursuing your trade priorities and your policy success? 95% of the world's customers live outside the US. And we are very efficient producers in US agriculture, and so we need to sell them our stuff. In corn specifically, we export about 15% of our corn crop. That's just looking at our direct corn exports. But when you take DDGs, ethanol, other feed products, starches, sweeteners into account, it's roughly about a quarter of the annual crop that ends up getting exported. And in Michigan, we've conducted economic impact studies in partnership with the Grains Council on the value of trade. Corn and corn product exports were valued at $424 million in the state of Michigan in 2018 and supported over 4,500 jobs in Michigan in 2018. So I think those are good numbers to sort of understand the really important economic ripple effect that trade has beyond the farm gate, and you know, the fact that trade benefits society as a whole, and agricultural trade is a really important economic engine in the United States. So we have a new administration coming in. In fact, they're coming in tomorrow. And I think that there are a lot of questions, of course, about what a change in administration is going to mean for trade policy. And we don't know everything, but what we do know is that, you know, there has been a little bit, and we saw this under the last 4 years with President Trump, there has been a little bit of a political realignment when it comes to trade. President Trump had some elements of his trade policy that had historically been more progressive in nature. And one of those elements was a real focus on Made in America and a focus on trade policy with the US manufacturing sector in mind. And I expect that there will be similarities under a Trump administration or a Biden administration's trade policy. It's expected that President-elect Biden will have a tough on China policy, or will have a tough China stance. We saw both candidates really talk tough on China on the campaign trail. And, you know, I think that we'll also see a lot of focus on enforcement priorities, as we've seen in the Trump administration. So those are areas where I think that we'll see some commonality and continuity with this new administration coming in. I will note on China that Joe Biden has said, you know, he doesn't intend to use tariffs as his major trade policy tool. I think that's the expectation, is that his administration will focus on what other tools do they have sort of in their arsenal to hold China accountable. And they've really emphasized rebuilding alliances and trying to build a coalition of other historical allies, other nations that can hold China together and leverage our, you know, international multilateral institutions like the WTO. And so I think that, you know, he will likely take a different approach to holding China accountable, though he said he is unlikely to get rid of the tariffs on China right away. You know, I think that we will see a more traditional policy making process out of this incoming administration. There are a lot of cabinet members and senior political officials who are returning from the Obama administration, and they're likely to take a more traditional policy making approach than we've seen in the Trump administration. Some might read that as slower or more deliberate, but it also, you know, for those of us in the business of working with the government every day, it also lends itself to a little bit more of a predictable process with more steps along the way for us to engage and ensure that the corn farmer has a seat at the table and has a voice in the process. It's expected that trade is not going to be the top priority right out of the gate for the Biden administration. Biden's top advisors have said that they plan to focus on domestic issues first and foremost. So their priorities in the first 100 days are going to be primarily addressing the coronavirus pandemic, both from a public health response standpoint and vaccine distribution standpoint, and from an economic recovery standpoint. It's expected that, we've already seen President-elect Biden roll out his coronavirus relief package last week. And it's expected that we'll see legislative action on that package or some version of that package in the subsequent weeks. But I'll note, we shouldn't forget that President-elect Biden was the top Democrat on Senate Foreign Relations for many, many years. He actually, when he was offered the position of vice president in the Obama administration, he actually had wanted to be Secretary of State. So, the inside scoop is that his advisors typically can't pull him away from foreign policy issues. So we should assume that this administration, will need to walk and chew gum on some global issues. And there will be trade issues that will be, on the plate from day one. And so I think that, the idea that there wouldn't be any trade policy making taking place is also incorrect. He will likely seek to start rebuilding relationships with more of our traditional partners. Think, other NATO nations, think European Union members, countries that the US has had a long history of working with. And then also rejoining multilateral institutions. I mentioned the World Trade Organization earlier. The US has had a frosty relationship with the World Trade Organization for the last few years. There is a need for reform within the WTO to make it work better and more efficiently, and to provide a more level playing field or a fair arbiter of trade disputes. And the Trump administration's approach to that was to kind of just disengage and hold up certain processes and entities within the WTO. It's expected that this incoming administration will work more within the WTO to help lead on that reform. President-elect Biden has also said he'll rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, rejoin the World Health Organization. And so we can expect that those different global multilateral institutions will see more participation and engagement from the US government under Biden's administration. I think it's also important to note that as we start to strengthen our cooperation with the European Union and work more closely with the European Union member states, there will be a lot of early cooperation, I'm sure, on coronavirus response. But to the extent that economic cooperation and trade is part of that conversation or subsequent conversations with the EU, it's really going to be important for the agricultural industry to be vigilant to ensure that if there are trade negotiations continuing with the EU, that we have a seat at the table and we can ensure that our long-standing issues with the EU, of which there are many across agriculture, that those issues are addressed, and that they don't kind of fall by the side of any agreements that are established. Some of the questions, some of the outstanding trade issues that I mentioned that the Biden administration will have to think about how they're going to address early on. Are the US-UK agreement. We've been in trade negotiations and have an agreement that is pretty close to being done. So the Biden administration will have to figure out kind of when and how they're going to engage, and if this is wrapping up this agreement is going to be a priority. The other question, the other sort of complicating factor there is Trade Promotion Authority, which is the process by which Congress, delegates authority to the president to negotiate trade agreements, but establishes this process that provides for congressional consultation around trade agreements, and establishes a process for a fast track, which is often referred to, fast track process for ratifying the trade agreement. That's the vote that the House and Senate have to take to implement a trade agreement. That trade promotion authority expires in the summer. It expires on the last day of June. So there is a lengthy timeline of checkpoints essentially that the administration has to go through with Congress before agreement gets a floor vote. So conventional wisdom suggests that the US-UK agreement would have to be wrapped up by April in order for it to have the possibility of getting a vote before Trade Promotion Authority expires. And certainly, whether or not the Biden administration asks for renewal of its Trade Promotion Authority and is granted Trade Promotion Authority, is going to have implications for what the United States does with other trade agreements. When you don't have TPA or Trade Promotion Authority, it could create an issue with the confidence of future trading partners in terms of, do they want to enter into a lengthy negotiation with the US if we don't have this process in place? And then the other piece of Trade Promotion Authority is that under the Trump administration, there was some frustration on the part of members of Congress for lack of consultation on trade actions. And so there's likely to be an effort in Congress to reform some of the trade authorities that the president has, and possibly to strengthen Congress's role or reassert Congress's role in trade. Now that doesn't mean that Congress would negotiate trade agreements, but rather, do they want to strengthen the consultation process and the requirements that are placed on the U.S. Trade Representative's office in the negotiating process? So there are some questions around whether any kind of reform effort might bog down the TPA process. Let's see, when TPA was renewed in 2015, that predated my time with NCGA. I joined in 2017. But my understanding is that it was something that NCGA worked really hard on, making sure that we had that Trade Promotion Authority, and it was a tough fight in Congress. It was a tough vote. So it's something for us to be cognizant of, because we may be working on it this year. We will likely be working on it this year. The other acronyms I have on the slide, CPTPP is the new Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. That agreement moved forward without the US when President Trump withdrew, I think the third day of his presidency. And that was a disappointment to NCGA because, as you'll hear in a minute, Southeast Asia is a huge priority for us and really for most of our global competitors, because it's such an important demand center. And so, the other 11 countries in TPP have moved forward. There are others that have expressed an interest in joining. And I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on this administration to figure out, what is its strategy for Southeast Asia. Not up on here, but I think it worth mentioning is the US has also started negotiations. I believe we've been through 2 or 3 rounds of negotiations with Kenya. And I think that, that will leave a question for the Biden administration about whether it intends to resume those negotiations or perhaps approach, sub-Saharan Africa with a more multilateral approach, and how it will prioritize the continent for trade. But I think there's a general consensus in the trade, among trade experts, that the US really needs to do more to engage with the African continent economically. And I would expect that this administration and many of the economic policy folks and foreign policy folks, for that matter, in this incoming administration would take that view. One other thing that I'll note is that we expect that labor and environmental priorities are going to have a central role in trade negotiations. I think that the administration's demonstrated focus on climate, which I think will be a very, very prominent #2 priority, second to coronavirus, is going to factor into trade negotiations. We saw labor and environment as the kind of final sticking points in the USMCA negotiation. And I think that some of the provisions that were achieved in USMCA are going to probably inform what we would put in future agreements. So the labor and environmental groups and constituencies will likely have a strong voice in US trade policy under this administration. And personnel is policy. So I think it's important to talk about, a couple key figures who will be very influential in agricultural trade in the Biden administration. They are, it's always nice when you have appointees announced and they're known quantities. So at USDA as secretary, we'll have Tom Vilsack returning. And, we know that trade is a priority to him. He spent the last several years as the CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council. And so trade has been very much on his mind. And if you're not familiar with U.S. Dairy Export Council, they're the dairy industry's U.S. Grains Council. They handle their overseas, or their global market development and export promotion work. And he also really knows the interagency process very well. He knows a lot of the other key foreign policy and economic officials in the Biden administration, and he has a close relationship with the president-elect. So he will likely be a very influential voice within the Biden cabinet, and very experienced, and he obviously knows the U.S. Department of Agriculture and a number of our trading partners, the other ag ministers quite well. So he'll be able to really hit the ground running. And he's also very aware of today's policy issues. And so, there will be I think a good degree of stability that comes with having Secretary Vilsack returning to USDA. Over at USTR, the nominee for US Trade Rep is Catherine Tai. She's also a known quantity to us. Catherine Tai has been the Chief International Trade Counsel on the House Ways and Means Committee, working for Chairman Neal from Massachusetts. And prior to that, she had been at done a stint at USTR, where she was in charge of China enforcement. So she is likely to continue that focus on China as the US trade rep if she's confirmed, and has great experience there. When she was at Ways and Means, NCGA's had the opportunity to work with Catherine. She seems universally liked, whether you are a labor or environmental group, or you're a member of the business community, the agricultural community, members on both sides of the aisle in Congress. Being universally liked in trade is basically like being a unicorn. So she's just known for being very, very smart, very approachable, and really and being very fair. And she was a key figure in the negotiation between the House Democrats and USTR over those final provisions in the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement implementing bill. So she was really, really critical to getting USMCA done, which had been a top priority for NCGA for the last couple of years. And so, I think that we will have somebody who is very willing to hear from all sides and all parties of an issue if Catherine is confirmed at USTR. So now I'm just going to review NCGA trade policy priorities. We have been focused primarily for the last few years on defending our top export markets and ensuring that the agreements that have, in part, remember Melissa's formula earlier, but in part and in combination with great market development work, have enabled the U.S. corn industry to be very dominant in our key export markets. We wanted to make sure that we would stay in those agreements or modify those agreements, but really have the certainty of the long-term trading relationships with our top export markets. Now it's time to get back on offense, and we are ready to pivot to a more proactive strategy. And we're going to be pushing for new markets, new trade agreements. And the top priority there is figuring out how the U.S. formally re-engages with Southeast Asia. There are geopolitical reasons to do it in terms of containing China's influence, and there are plenty of economic reasons to re-engage with Southeast Asia. Countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand are important markets. In several cases, they're already robust markets for corn products. But we see major opportunity. The 13 countries that make up Southeast Asia and Oceania are together 702 million people. Those are 702 million customers. And the feed and renewable energy demand is growing exponentially. And so it's just a really important region for us to ensure that we have more formal trade ties, especially because our competitors, I mentioned CPTPP earlier, but there have been a number of other trade agreements like the EU-Vietnam agreement, for example, that have been formalized in the last few years. And so we're really losing our competitive edge and falling behind in Southeast Asia. And so, we've got to get in the game. The other thing that I would like to highlight in terms of expansion is promoting ethanol export expansion. This is something that the Grains Council has really prioritized because there's a huge growth opportunity, particularly as countries examine how they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and their environmental footprint. Different opening up to ethanol is a really important opportunity. Now, we've seen a little bit of a slowdown as a result of people are driving and traveling less, so there's less petroleum consumption. But overall, as normal life hopefully starts to resume, we see that as a really important opportunity. And so NCGA on the policy front is doing what we can to support ethanol export expansion and awareness, for example, on Capitol Hill about the opportunity there. The second major pillar of our trade policy priorities is mitigating trade barriers. And, I mentioned ethanol, and one of the key trade barriers that we're dealing with right now that we're going to be pushing the new administration to address is the tariff. We have a 20% tariff on ethanol exports to Brazil. Brazil used to be our top export market for ethanol. And what was meant to be a temporary tariff rate quota has now turned into a 20% tariff across the board. This has been something that we've worked really closely with the Grains Council and Growth, Energy, and RFA, our partners in the ethanol industry, to address and to work with the U.S. government to address. But I think one of the side effects of coronavirus, one of the economic side effects of the COVID pandemic, is that in countries where they're not providing as much direct relief to their producers, they face a lot of political pressure to keep trade barriers in place or erect new ones to help their domestic industries. And that's not how this barrier started, but we do think that that the COVID pandemic created some of the political dynamics around why this barrier is still in place. So this is going to require some senior political engagement. And given that, we don't have the prospect of a bigger trade agreement with Brazil in place, it's unclear, what that's going to look like in terms of U.S. engagement. The other, there are plenty of other trade barriers. I will just say, what we usually think of when we think of the most common trade barriers that the corn industry faces are barriers to the production tools and technologies that corn farmers in the US use to be productive and to be more sustainable. So biotechnology, various crop protection products, and gene editing, though that's still an up and coming technology. Those are the barriers that we experience probably most commonly. And, you know, we're always working really hard to provide education and try and push for science and risk-based rulemaking, regulatory approaches to how countries, you know, take those products into account and you know, make approvals for imports. You know, the European Union is probably the biggest challenge. You know, I mentioned earlier the possibility of negotiations. Those are the challenges we would seek to address and want to see resolved within the context of a trade negotiation with the European Union. And we're seeing the Europeans get more aggressive in promoting things like a 50% reduction in pesticide use and trying to export that approach to other countries that we seek to trade with. So the conflict in our philosophies around food and agriculture policy is bleeding over into other markets that are important to us. The third major pillar is implementation and enforcement of our existing trade agreements. USMCA, Japan, and China are, you know, our most recent deals, and those are ones that we're watching the implementation process to ensure that there's compliance. And so, you know, the China deal, I think, is the big one. And we expect, again, President-elect Biden has said he'll stay in the China deal, at least until his administration has the opportunity to put together a new China strategy. So that's one that we're watching. And as you know, there have been robust corn purchases this year in year one of the China deal. But we're also watching some of the more systemic regulatory reforms there. And then we've also had some challenges around biotechnology and crop protection regulatory barriers in Mexico. Mexico recently released a decree saying that it would ban GMO corn and it would ban glyphosate, and that has really risen as a top issue that we're asking this administration to address in its early days. The final pillar is increasing investment in the market access program and foreign market development program. Those are two Farm Bill programs that help fund organizations like the U.S. Grains Council, who do our overseas market development work. And it's really critical to the American corn farmers' competitiveness in global markets. And then finally, this is just a short slide to recap some of the programs that NCGA is supporting, some of the work that we're supporting to support the policy environment that will best allow you to export corn and corn products. So we've engaged with partnerships and coalitions like Farmers for Free Trade, supporting grassroots education through our trade school program that we do jointly with the Grains Council and the state corn organizations, and the Mazal initiative, which is a really critical program where we work with the Grains Council and corn farmer associations from Brazil and Argentina to promote global biotechnology acceptance and crop protection acceptance. And so that is my presentation. Thank you all for the opportunity and for your support for NCGA's trade work.
Leslie, thank you very much. Ladies, both of you, excellent job. And Angel, I know we've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, we have several questions from the audience. I'll try to direct them to Melissa or Leslie, but if you have something to add and I didn't direct it to you, please feel free to chime in. We had one question about what was TPP, and I think maybe this one's for Leslie, but is it likely that the Biden administration will try to get us back into that agreement? Is there any opportunity to get back into that agreement, or are we looking at a different pathway forward for Southeast Asia?
One of the key things that we're going to be asking the Biden administration to do is to figure out how to get us back into to formalize trade ties within Southeast Asia. Getting into CPTPP is probably the most logical way to do that. So that's sort of the new updated version of TPP, which was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's challenging because the Biden administration will have to square the agreement as it's written now with what Congress is willing to ratify. And so, one thing they might do is go in and ask to renegotiate a few key areas with provisions that Congress would need to find the agreement more palatable. and that all of those trading partners, the other 11 would be willing to accept. That is a tough balancing act, but that is probably the most logical path forward. Otherwise, they'd have to kind of start a negotiation from scratch, and they'd likely be using a lot of the Trans-Pacific Partnership text to do it. So I think that we'll be able to make a case. I think this is a priority for most of agriculture, and it's a priority for the business community writ large to really be more competitive in this region. So I think it's something we'll be asking them to do early on.
Thanks. We also had a question, and I think this one is for you, Melissa, about kind of what the top countries are for trade with the US.
Yeah, certainly. And I'm going to share my screen right quick. Go back to, let's see. Someday I'm going to be smooth enough to do this in one click. So here we have top corn, and these are infographics that are available on our website. I'm happy to drop a link into the chat as we're doing this, and maybe on Facebook as well. So looking at where is corn going, our top market by far is Mexico. Next is Japan, and for years, those vied for the top spot. But the last several years, it's been Mexico and then Japan, then Colombia, South Korea, and then actually last year, this is last marketing year, was China. They came in with some big sales. I think it's worth noting when we talk about policy priorities, all of these are really interesting and complex policy markets. Mexico is obviously our partner in USMCA. We did a kind of phase 1 deal with Japan. Under the Trump administration, there are free trade agreements with both Colombia and South Korea. And then obviously we've talked about phase 1 with China, although the economics of corn sales to China are really, driving that in addition to policy. Looking at ethanol, the top market is Canada, Brazil, with whom we have reciprocal trade, and that has also had some policy challenges. India, which is an interesting market because they don't actually use ethanol for fuel. They don't import ethanol for fuel. They produce it domestically. So all of our ethanol sales to India are actually industrial ethanol. That's an area of major work for us in recent years. South Korea, once again, really focused on industrial ethanol, and they're a big kind of regional blender. And then the Netherlands. And when you look at where our grain in all forms going, that's the corn, ethanol, DDGs, and other products, as Leslie was talking about, CGM, CGF, DCO, so corn distillers oil, sweeteners, all of those things. Mexico, again, takes that top spot because they buy all of that stuff. Japan, once again, big purchaser, especially of corn. China came in last year towards the end with sales and continues to be there. South Korea and Canada. So I'll put a link in the chat and the Facebook chat where you can find these graphics.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of really helpful infographics and things on the trade toolkit over on the Grains Council website. Leslie, we had a couple of questions about Mexico and those potential trade barriers around biotech and glyphosate. Could you talk a little bit more about how likely that is to interrupt our trade with them, especially with them being one of our top partners?
Sure. And this is something that Melissa and I have been working a lot on together, so she might have some comments as well. This has probably become the most urgent trade issue that I've been working on in recent months and weeks. But I think it's important to start with by underscoring that trade to Mexico has not been disrupted yet. So we have not seen these recent actions result in export disruption. We're trying to prevent that from happening. We've been monitoring with partners in the biotech and crop protection industry for a while, a regulatory shift in Mexico where we saw import licenses rejected for glyphosate out of their Mexico's environment ministry, and we have not seen a biotech trait approved for import since May of 2018. So initially we were working this through, USTR and USDA at a more technical level, but really started to raise the alarm bells about this issue a little bit less than a year ago. And it's something that, very senior political officials from Ambassador Lighthizer and Ambassador Dowd at USTR to Undersecretary McKinney and Secretary Perdue at USDA were addressing with their counterparts in Mexico directly. Unfortunately, the current administration in Mexico has a lot of political activism in the cabinet, and we've seen these anti-production agriculture, anti-technology, and anti-import sentiments and the rhetoric grow, and it's resulted in this decree that was formally adopted at the end of December. It would phase out the use of glyphosate by 2024, and it would ban GMO corn in Mexican diets, which is a little bit of a vague language to it's kind of hard to determine, is that going to apply to animal feed, which is the bulk of our corn exports to Mexico go toward. So we're very concerned about this. We're concerned that a lot of the policy is influenced by kind of the European approach. And this is something that, again, it has not disrupted trade yet, but we are really going to ask the Biden administration very early on to intervene. We believe that this is in violation of USMCA. It's in violation of Mexico's commitments to the World Trade Organization. And so, there may be a legal pathway that we ultimately have to go down, but it's also just completely impractical for Mexico to abandon this relationship because their livestock need our feed. Melissa, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
I think that was very comprehensive. The only thing I would add is I think it's important to recognize this is one reason why overseas presence is so important. We have an office in Mexico City and actually various people throughout Mexico who just live there and kind of were teleworking before it was cool because they want to be close to their customers. And, we're working pretty closely to understand the situation down there. As Leslie indicated, it's not 100% clear what this decree means and how it would be implemented. That's in development. And so having people there on the ground to talk to local stakeholders, to try to assess that with the government in local language, those are all really important pieces of the work that we do. We like it to be more on offense than defense, but often you need the defense too.
So on the topic of kind of GM traits, we had a question from one of our Facebook viewers about that approval process in China for new traits on corn and kind of what that looks like going forward and maybe what you guys are seeing and working on in that arena.
Melissa, do
you want me to do that one?
I'm happy to. I mean, what we saw in the phase 1 agreement with China was a commitment to it's a 2-year agreement. So the first year wraps in February, and then we'll have another year in the agreement, assuming the Biden administration or China doesn't make any changes to that timeline. And there were purchase agreements in multiple sectors, including agriculture, and then there were structural reforms. There were, I believe, 57 structural reforms in the agriculture space that China agreed to, and they've delivered on most of them. One of those was to reform their regulatory process for approving biotechnology traits for import. They agreed to a couple different meetings a year of their biosafety committee. They agreed to a more transparent and predictable process that would result in things like, I believe, notifying registrants within a certain period of time if there were problems with their applications. There were timelines for the average length of the process, but and on the biotech piece, we have not seen that reform finalized, but we also were not expecting that to be done until at least roughly this time within the agreement. So they have a little bit more time to deliver on the biotech piece, and we will see if it happens. There's also, in terms of enforcement, there is a path within the phase 1 agreement for if China does not comply with its commitments, kind of what happens next. Melissa, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add, I mean, we saw last week, maybe the week before, China approved some biotech traits that had been developed in China. So, when we talk about biotechnology or technology in general, it's, there's a kind of big picture acceptance, and then there's, how their approval processes works for imports, either of seed to be planted or, feed in our case, or human consumption. And often there are distinctions between those. So, we see that, local approvals are a positive. They are not going to necessarily make any big difference in production right now, but we do know China is concerned about overall supply, right? Like that's one of the drivers behind huge purchases at the moment. But like most things in agriculture, this is not an instant question. Policy takes a long time, science takes a long time. And I think it's important to think about that big picture, as well as take those opportunities like Leslie described to improve the process through which we need to work, and also the likelihood that that process will work.
And I think it's important to mention that the timelines that China committed to were on average, an average window. So the cynics will say that they'll have shorter timelines for domestic company approvals and longer timelines for international, multinational corporations. Something to watch.
Well, we're a little bit past 9, so I want to be respectful of people's time. I'll turn it over to Terry in a second, but I did want to mention that if trade is a topic that you're really interested in, a couple of our upcoming Coffee with Corn sessions also deal with trade. So February 2nd, we'll be looking at meat exports, and February 23rd, we have a whole session that's just about trade with China. So those are a couple that you should have on your radar if this is a topic that you care about a lot. And with that, I'm going to toss it back over to Terry.
All right, Angel. Ladies, just one thought. I want you to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 your confidence in the Biden administration ag policies for the next 4 years, with 10 being the most confident, 1 being the least confident. Melissa, let's start with you.
I'm going to probably take a buy on this one. I mean, I am confident we will have a new administration, and I am confident they will have policies, and we will see what happens after that. Also important to recognize we don't work in U.S. politics, so I'll abstain and let Leslie take that one.
Boy, thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciate that.
With friends like this, hey.
Here's what I'll say. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do, and I think that there are going to be competing factions looking to influence this administration within the Democratic Party. What I am confident about is that the narrow margins in the House and Senate will require both sides of the aisle to get things done, or nothing will get done. And I'm confident that we have a really strong advocate in Secretary Vilsack, who knows that one of his top jobs will be to advocate, not just with the White House, but with all of his colleagues in the other agencies. He understands our issues, from biotech to biofuels to trade. And so I hope that we'll see a more centrist, pragmatic approach to policymaking in this administration, but I think I would be a fool to put a number on it. So you have strong organizations working for you in Washington, and we'll certainly do our best.
Well, so if I can add something, not to go back on my not giving a number, because I'm not going to do that either. But I do think one thing that's important to note, we didn't talk about much here because limited time. We're looking at environmental policy being a lot more important. I think that can sound scary potentially. And also when we are talking about ethanol, both in the US and overseas, I mean, there is a huge potential there. We have a product that really does offer actual verifiable benefits for air quality, human health, et cetera. And making that case is something we've been doing. I think there's a lot of opportunity going forward in that space. And certainly we see overseas, we've been talking about the Paris agreement, because that is an aspect of what countries who are looking at ways to diversify their fuel, that's part of why they're doing it. So I actually am, we're not going to say the whole administration, every policy, but in that area, I'm kind of excited to see what happens.
The other last point is that there's been there's been really great outreach to the ag groups from the Biden transition and the incoming officials. And I think that that's a good sign that at least we'll have a seat at the table, even if we don't like every policy.
Ladies, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it, and I know all of our participants have. We've held practically every one of the participants from over the first 5 minutes of our talk today. This is wonderful. Just in closing, real quick, Melissa, Leslie, if someone wants to communicate with you, if they do have some questions, how do they go about doing it? Melissa first.
Send me an email. My email is mkessler, Kessler, @grains.org.
And Leslie?
I am putting it into the chat right now. Email me at mcnitt, MCNITT, @ncga.com.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much, participants, for getting your questions to us. Now, we do have up on the screen our closing poll. So if you're watching us via Zoom, please fill out those poll questions on your screen. So again, just take a moment and fill those out. We really appreciate your input, folks. And speaking of that, Corn Growers Association members, those of you that are viewing, we want to remind you to return your surveys that we sent out to you a while back. The deadline for that is January the 25th, if you'd like to have a chance to win a Carhartt jacket. So again, if you have the opportunity, fill out our closing poll. And also, if you haven't filled out the Corn Growers Association members survey, please do that as well. Now, we alluded to some of the things coming up. Angel did. Next week, we're going to be partnering with the Michigan Corn Growers Association for their annual meeting. And we're also going to be updating the state and national political climate from the Michigan Corn Growers Association national and state lobbyists. So yeah, the political is not going to go away. The inauguration is tomorrow, and a new administration is going to be moving in, a lot of new players. And I guess it's more important than ever before for agriculture to step up and be counted. Again, to register to our events coming up, if you'd like to view those, you can go to www.micorn.org/events. On behalf of all of our participants today, I'm Terry Henney. Have yourself a great day today.